Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Susan Patrick from the Aurora Institute, and I'm joining you live from the Student-Centered Learning for Equity Conference here at the Science Museum in beautiful St. Paul. And I'll introduce my colleague, Fred Jones. Fred?
Hi, Susan. Thank you for the warm introductions. My name is Fred Jones. I am the Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy Director here at the Southern Education Foundation. I was formerly with the Aurora Institute as of a few months ago, but I'm really looking forward to presenting with Susan this afternoon and joining you all this morning rather. From Atlanta, Georgia. I'm actually doing the presentation from, and I just want to say thank you for having us and me, myself, personally. So thank you.
Thank you, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to do this presentation virtually today. Next slide, please. So Fred and I are pleased to be able to share the work that we have been doing on advancing the transformation of policy. The mission of the Aurora Institute is to drive the transformation of education systems and accelerate the advancement of breakthrough policies and practices to ensure high quality learning for all. And our vision embodies all people. All people are empowered to attain the knowledge, skills, and dispositions necessary to achieve success, contribute to their communities, and advance society. And it's one where we're thinking deeply about purpose and the purpose of education in terms of human flourishing. Next slide, please. So as we get started, I just want to hone in on our organizational values. We are leading with student-centered and equity-driven, future-focused, knowledge-driven, collaborative, and credible. Next slide, please. In our organizational values as well, I think it's important to point out that we are nonpartisan and we work across, as a nonprofit organization, we work across divisions, and we work to help share and lift up ideas that will transform education for all youth. In our work, we do work on studying what is happening around the globe on the future of education, create and advance student-centered policies and education policy, build on research for new learning models and future-focused practice to support student-centered learning, and we convene, catalyze change at every level. We work on building diversity, equity, and inclusion into every pillar of our work. Next slide, please. And so with that, we'll get started. We're going to start just by sharing some key definitions and terminology we'll be using. These definitions are showing up in state policy across the country too. And we also just want to be open about where we're coming from in working with the field. We've surveyed thousands of practitioners and educators across the field to develop these definitions and the terminology. Next slide, please. So the first definition is one called student-centered learning, and the Bush Foundation in their program has also really powerful definitions on student-centered learning. At Aurora, we're using definition: students take ownership and have agency over their own learning. Learning is personalized. Learning can happen anywhere, anytime, and learning is competency-based. And next slide, please. The next definition is competency-based education. In 2011, we worked with the field and developed the original 5-part definition of competency-based education. In 2019, we worked with the field as our knowledge deepened to advance it. And first, students are empowered daily to set goals, to make decisions about their learning experiences and how they create and apply that knowledge, how they will demonstrate their learning. For them, in competency-based education, as students are demonstrating their learning, the process of assessment is meaningful and positive. It gives students immediate feedback, provides timely information, and evidence of that learning. Students, if they're not yet mastering their learning, they get immediate, timely, differentiated support and feedback to ensure that their learning needs are met. Core to competency-based education is that students progress based on demonstrated mastery and evidence of that mastery, not just seat time with variable outcomes. Students are actively learning. They have different pathways and varied pacing. There are strategies to ensure equity for all students embedded in the culture, the structures, and in the pedagogy of schools and competency-based education systems. And last, rigorous common expectations for learning are transparent, explicit, and transferable. Next slide, please. So that gives you an idea of student-centered learning. Competency-based is part of student-centered learning. And what we mean by personalized is that learning is tailored for each student's strengths per person, needs and interests, including enabling student voice and choice in what, how, when, and where they learn, inside and outside of school, in the community, to provide flexibility and supports to ensure mastery. Next slide, please. Educational equity in designing for equity means fairness and justice, ensuring that each individual receives what they need to fully develop and succeed. It is not equality or the same treatment, which does not take different needs or disparate outcomes into account. Next slide, please. And Fred, there's a comparison here between the traditional education system with competency-based education that I think is really helpful. Let me turn this over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. It's very important to understand, as Susan just elevated, the difference between equality and equity. And she just provided our definition of equity. And the reason why I just want to start there is just so important that the value of equity is centered to our work and really our community. And I know within this community that is the case, but to make transformational change, equity has to be at the center of what we do and how we improve systems change, and especially within the education sector. In order for us to actually increase outcomes for students, equity has to be an intrinsic value. And so understanding the difference between equity and equality, I think it's imperative in terms for us to get to the outcomes that we want to see for all students. And so actually on the prior slide, there was a report that the Aurora Institute published a few years ago that talks about specifically designing for equity. And lifted from that report, we have repurposed this chart that's on this slide right here. It talks about the flaws of the traditional system, unique features of CBE, and then embedding CBE within the equity framework. And so if you want to learn more, definitely we can send around the report, but it's important. I'm just going to speak on the slide for a second. But yes, this is the report. Thank you. And it's important that we look at very specific components of the traditional system versus what it ideally should be with equity score. So if you just look at the support row, right? In the traditional system, we provide targeted support after we have identified serious academic or behavioral needs, both from a positive or a negative standpoint. So this is definitely being reactive based off of the information that is observed or the information that is gleaned from different assessments. CBE, unique features of CBE, is actually providing design, timely and differentiated instruction, right? In real time, day to day, we figure out how to serve each individual student. If we bake in CBE, or if we bake in the unique features of CBE and really ground it in equity, I just want to read what we've put out here. It says, provides the necessary and sometimes disproportionate level of resources to each learner to interrupt historical inequities and to cultivate each learner's unique talents and interests. It's important that as we talk about equity, we both understand the history behind the inequality really that's happened to different communities and students over time. And also within the current context, we have serious inequality and inequity within our system. And in order for us, again, to change outcomes, equity has to be the center of what we do. Next slide, please. And so as we transition and talk about specific policy issues and how student-centered learning is connected to equity, we're going to identify specific state policies to help elevate outcomes, both from a student-centered learning perspective that's grounded in equity. If we go next slide, please. So essentially, there are several state policy entry points to advance student-centered learning and competency-based education. We understand that states are likely at different phases within the work. So there are states getting started, states that are a little bit maybe more experienced, and then states that are definitely much more advanced, taking a comprehensive approach to developing and advancing student-centered learning state policies. I'll focus just right now, just for the sake of this presentation, just on the left-hand side where states are just getting started. There are multiple entry points. You don't necessarily need to go in this specific order. I think what needs to be taken into consideration is interest from the community, what's politically active, where there's energy and interest. But essentially, the first item up here, an entry point into this work, is states who have developed or want to develop a portrait of a graduate, also known as a profile of a graduate, which is essentially a document that is developed collectively with different diverse stakeholders across the state to redefine what success looks like. It is essentially the North Star of what education should be like and the skills that high school graduates should be able to possess once they graduate from college. Additionally, innovation zones are essentially providing flexibility from state laws and regulations that allow districts and schools to try new innovative approaches to student-centered learning. There's also the development of a CBE task force and pilots. Additionally, credit flexibility, and then multiple pathways to graduation. And then states maybe in the middle throng here is there's several different entry points that. One thing I do want to highlight, because this is something I'm going to speak to a little bit later, is workforce modernization and diversification of the educator workforce. And then also states taking a comprehensive approach to advancing student-centered learning, where they're putting multiple entry points together and really advancing them in a comprehensive way to change the system, really to change the whole entire ecosystem of how education is delivered in our states and across the country. Next slide, please. So here are some more very specific state policies that support student-centered learning, which is advancing student-centered learning, competency-based education systems itself, not looking at this in isolation. We want to build educator capacity and also modernize the educator workforce. Increase access to and the affordability of educator preparation programs to increase educator diversity. Things like grow your own programs, redesign more innovative and balanced systems of authentic assessments, working with communities to come up with different ways to actually evaluate student success. We also want to invest, we think it's important that states invest in assessment literacy, not just for the educator, but also for parents, for students, for community members, so everyone actually has a comprehensive sense of what the data, how you glean data from different forms of assessments. We want to engage communities in new accountability designs, especially as we are adapting to this new reality in this well, I don't want to say post, but following the height of COVID-19. And then we think it's very important that states are very specific about reversing the inequities exacerbated by COVID-19, both from an academic standpoint, but also from a social and emotional standpoint as well. And then we think it's really important that states transform state funding formulas to interrupt historical inequities. Many states across this country have outdated severely outdated funding formulas that are 30 and 40 years old. And so it's important as we're trying to advance equity and improve outcomes that's both student-centered and equity-based, reforming state funding formulas are going to be key to doing so. Next slide, please. And I'm going to transition to Susan to highlight some of these examples from states who are doing some of this work.
Thanks, Fred. And this work is happening all across the United States. If you think about the value and the equity values centered in students being focused on assets of students and communities, on broad and holistic definitions of success, on true personalization for each student's needs, supporting anywhere, anytime learning, and that assessment is meaningful. Think about that and how that might contrast with the traditional system or the policies. So state policies that are advancing student-centered, competency-based education really are working to redefine student success through these profile of graduates. South Carolina, Vermont, Virginia, Wyoming right now is working on a new profile of a graduate, and it's happening in communities. It's from the grassroots and listening from across communities to define what do students need to know and be able to do in terms of knowledge and skills, much more holistically. You have innovation zones in Kentucky and Arkansas that are a partnership between the state system, the State Department of Ed, and districts and schools doing the work, where they're inviting and asking districts and schools to lift up policy barriers that are getting in the way, and they're committing to removing those policy barriers and regulation, working with the legislature to remove the policy barriers to innovation in statute. And so competency-based ed task forces, which bring together diverse stakeholders from across the state, including K through 12, community-based organizations, youth-based organizations, higher ed, and the workforce, say what would it take to advance competency-based pathways in our state and begin that work with a series of recommendations. We've seen that in Iowa, Idaho, Washington State more recently, which is now starting a new competency-based ed pilot. So the next step in states are to help support, build capacity at the local level and with educators in doing the redesign work towards competency-based education through pilot programs. Clearly, when you think about what are ways that we can support anywhere, anytime learning, seat time becomes a really archaic policy that hinges on awarding credits, hinges on funding models, hinges on what students can do. So moving away from seat time to advancing policy that's built on mastery and supporting student needs, credits defined by competencies in New Hampshire and Oregon. There are big questions right now on what is a meaningful credential. If you think about the number of students that are graduating from high school and diplomas, and how many students actually need remediation when they go to 2-year or 4-year colleges, what does it mean to have currency in the credential that actually exhibits your knowledge and skills? So there's been work in mastery transcripts and proficiency-based diplomas in Colorado and Arizona. You have a Grand Canyon diploma in Rhode Island and other states. And there is conversation in the policy world around what would it look like if students actually advance on mastery from pre-K, K-12, into career tech ed and higher ed and the workforce, not tracking, not a single pathway, but if there were articulated competency-based pathways so that students could essentially build those pathways and credentials based on competencies where they can earn credit and build up recognized and validated credentials all across. So Alabama is actually working on a lifelong system of continuous learning. And Washington State is also exploring how do we create truly aligned and coherent competency-based pathways for supporting a lifetime of learning anywhere, anytime. Next slide, please. So Fred, I'm going to turn it back to you and dig in on two really important issues focused on equity for student-centered learning. Take a historical look. Over to you, Fred.
Thank you, Susan. So one of the things that we did is we wanted to take an historical perspective on some current, really important issues in terms of us being able to advance student-centered learning, and specifically advance outcomes for all students. And so we looked at two issues: one, teacher diversification, and two, assessments. And so we're going to provide a historical analysis, but also tie that into a current day context. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So how do we get here? So this quick analysis is largely based off of the African-American population. So just understand that for context. But essentially dating back, actually, I know it's not on here, but actually dating back to the end of the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, and then advancing into the 1910s, the 1920s, and 1930s. There's actually a large number of Black educators across the country. And actually, because of the development of also historically Black colleges and universities during the early part of the 1900s, produced the overwhelming majority of all Black college graduates. And as of the 1950s, it was so common for individuals who were African American at the time who had a college degree, half of them were educators as of the 1950s. As we advance and following the Brown versus Board of Education, the decision and the closure of a number of Black schools, actually a number of Black educators lost their jobs. Actually, 38,000 Black educators throughout the South and southern bordering states lost their jobs due to integration. That was one unintended consequence of integration, was the loss of so many Black educators that we have never actually recovered from. And so also, in addition to the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, there was a number of private schools that were developed around 1958 and going into 1960s as a response to Brown versus Board and integration. And we at the Southern Education Foundation actually call these segregation academies. They were specifically founded after Brown v. Board and were schools that were largely racially isolated. So typically only white pupils and white teachers were educated and worked in those schools, at those schools. And these were positions that were not available to many African Americans who just lost their jobs. And then in addition to that, there was also new teacher entrance exams that were racially biased and actually started to dissuade a lot of African American teachers at that time from becoming educators. Now, I know a lot happened between the 60s and where we are at 2022 today, but we as a community just have not replenished the percentage and amount of educators that we used to have in the 1950s, as early as the 1950s. And so there's issues, right? So in the current context today, there's extremely low teacher pay. And then, especially for African-American students and other students who come from low-income families, they have a disproportionate burden on taking on student debt to actually get through school. And because of the debt and the low teacher pay, we still have many people in our educator workforce that don't come from a lot of different backgrounds, and so that impacts really our students today. If we go to the next slide. I just wanted to also just provide a couple resources in terms of if people are interested in learning more about why our educator workforce looks the way that it does. These are some short pieces that you can find both in The Economist and also in Ed, goes into details on the history of educator workforce, at least as it relates to um, Black Americans and Black educators. So if you want to learn more, please look to those resources. And then if you want to learn more, in addition to that, I have also some books that I can recommend to you as well. Next slide, please. So here is an updated slide actually from the Pew Research Center that shows the population change for students over the last 30 years and by race and ethnicity, but also by teachers as well over the last 30 years. So what we see is we have an increasingly diverse student population, but we have a pretty homogeneous educator population, um, even though we have a very diverse student population. So if you look above today, roughly 80% of the teachers are white or Caucasian. However, we have um, just over 50% of our student population are students of color throughout the country. And so little has actually changed in terms of the numbers of educators of color. If it's only actually went up about 7% over 20 or over 30 years. So it's increased from 13% to 20% today. And the largest share of this actually has been in the Hispanic or Latinx population, moving from 3% to 9%. But we still just don't have equal representation in the educator workforce as we do to the student population. Next slide. So why does this matter? This matters for a couple of reasons. One, there is literally tons of research that shows the perceptions and the relationship between teachers and students actually impacts the expectation of students and what they can learn. And so there is a potential to exacerbate both an achievement and opportunity gap if we don't have a more diverse workforce. The other item, which isn't on this slide, but the next slide, that literally a more diverse educator workforce actually improves social outcomes and academic outcomes for all students. And so we need to also just keep that in mind. Having a more diverse workforce is good for white students, African American students, Hispanic students, and all students to ensure that we have really our community reflects who's teaching kids in the classroom and the opportunities that are available to us. Do we have a diverse teacher workforce? The answer is unfortunately not, as the data just shows from the prior slide, but there are a few institutional we don't have a diverse teacher workforce today. One, we know the data shows that 50% of the Black educators across the country are graduates of historically Black colleges and universities, and these universities are historically underfunded both at the federal and state level. And additionally, as of recently, the US Department of Education has historically not provided any funding specifically to programs to increase diversity in the educator workforce, although as of recently, President Biden has actually presented one proposal for funding, but historically this has not been the case. Go to the next slide. Just some state policy goals that we want to leave you with is one, we think it's very important to establish the policy goal of having an educator profession that reflects the racial composition of the student population. That's number one. Number two, seed and fund grow your own teaching programs. So these are programs that are funded typically by state departments of education or other advocacy organizations in some places, but typically at the State Department level, where there is a strategic focus to diversify the workforce and recruit and retain a diverse population of individuals to becoming educators. And so in Tennessee is an example of one of the Grow Your Own programs where they actually look at this from a segment from age. So they have a way in which different individuals can become educators at the high school level, at the college level, those who work in the school system but may not be educators, and also folks who are retired or community members, and they have the opportunity to have an apprenticeship and a pathway to becoming an educator. So that's one example. So we think it's important to see to fund these localized programs that we think can adapt to the local issues within those states. Additionally, we want to provide technical assistance to districts with diversity-focused recruitment and retention strategies, to be very specific about that, and then fund teacher residencies to increase recruitment and retention of diverse educators in high-need districts specifically. So those are just some of the policy solutions to help increasing the diversity of the educator workforce, and I'm happy to answer some additional questions about this later on today. I think next slide. And at this point, I'll transition to Susan to go through the historical analysis of assessments in this country as well.
Thank you, Fred. When we think about assessments and think about K through 12 education across the United States and the outcomes that are producing, is it enough to continue to tweak the current system that we have? Will education change fast enough? When I'm in conversations with global leaders from ministries of education around the globe, they're asking big questions around what is the purpose of education? What do students need to know and be able to do? So really encouraged by the profile of a graduate conversations that are happening in communities. But they're asking questions like, will education transform fast enough to save the human species? Think about that. That is the context that we're operating in for assessments and education policy in the US. Next slide, please. How do we get here? How do we get here? Assessment policy in the US, think about a historical perspective. Okay. Even in 2001, when No Child Left Behind was passed in a bipartisan effort, the reason was in the 1990s, there was a big push for standards-based education, and all 50 states were to set basic standards in English language arts and in mathematics. How many states actually had standards by 2000? 11. 11. So there was a big call for more transparency on student outcomes, and there wasn't an infrastructure. So comparing students by having standardized tests that could give comparability and outcomes became a really big focus of the law that still undergirds everything we do today. And maybe it's important to take a historical perspective of where those tests came from originally. They have a history from eugenics. Okay. This slide is a build, Carly, so maybe you can go through a couple more. What else do we have in terms of literacy tests, disqualifying certain individuals? A lack of academic standards in states did lead to this whole conversation around standards, transparency, 95% of students coming. From 2001 forward, we've been doing this now for 20 years. And what are the results showing us? They're pretty flat. We're putting kids into age-based, grade-based, one-size-fits-all models of education with a one-size-fits-all, one type, even with the flexibility in ESSA, the end of year summative assessments, drive the system, ask whether assessments are actually leading to the desired improvement of teaching and learning, or continuous improvement that is in the words of the federal law, whether that's happening or whether we are so locked into what this is doing in the backwash of the system. Are we actually getting the kind of transformation? So that's a question I'm posing. From No Child Left Behind to ESSA, it emphasizes comparability and ranking and sorting schools and ranking and sorting students. And that's where we are. It's very hierarchical. Think about that with an equity lens. Next slide, please. So where are we today? We have 20 years of this data. we see the opportunity gaps. Schools have still not changed how they provide teaching, learning experiences. We know research from the learning sciences on how students learn best, and that is to provide enduring opportunities for deeper learning, for relevant ways of getting to the learning objectives, culturally responsive and inclusive teaching. And we can have information on where students are. This isn't about a lack of transparency or a lack of information. In a competency-based, truly student-centered education system, you know where every student is every day. So how do we think differently about assessment frames that right now are prioritizing comparability, ranking and sorting, culling and sorting students and ranking schools, not with an asset frame, but with a deficit frame? So even though in 2020, we had the Department of Education provide flexibility for states given COVID, given everything that communities, families, educators were going through, opening the door to increase flexibilities. Are we gonna snap back? Or are we gonna ask different questions about how we can transform the assessments to be more aligned with true student-centered learning, and also innovating assessments to give us better information on improving teaching, on improving learning for students every day with evidence of student work and actual growing support for aligning our assessment system to support culturally relevant instruction and assessments too. Next slide. So if we are visioning a future state of what is possible, it does start with examining the purpose of our education system. What do we want students to know and be able to do? But also the values. The assessment systems that we have are very much tied to the values. And that is a conversation for communities to engage in. What do students need to learn and be able to do? What do we hold as values? When we redefine success, focused on purpose, is our system fit for purpose? Is it fit for human flourishing? Then we think about how can you innovate assessments? How can you innovate assessments? How can you have students really focus on producing knowledge and that evidence of what they've learned? And how do you assure that assessments are meaningful for students and give them the feedback they need? How do we support truly competency-based assessments with common rubrics that are understood? Assessment literacy is about understanding and recognizing what is an appropriate assessment for the circumstance, the kinds of learning, and how do we validate that learning in different ways. Next slide. So Fred, let's take a look. This is an overview of these future actions that states can take. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we just want to leave you again with some very clear ideas on how states can potentially move forward to invest in the learner promise, advance competency-based student-centered learning with equity at its core. And so again, this is recruiting and training, retaining, and promoting teachers of color through grants, loan forgiveness, or grow your own pathways, which I mentioned earlier. There's a number of states that have really good programs which we can send to you, but the purpose behind this all is to help diversify the educator workforce and provide state and sometimes local investments in terms of how we go about diversifying the educator workforce. And then we also want to institute culturally relevant professional development and curriculum design for the educator workforce as well. So this is incredibly important to make sure that we're, one, in a place that's safe for all educators, but then two, increasing the safety for students, for all students within our school system. And then I'll transition to you, Susan, to go through the remaining recommendations.
Sure. And when we think about what can states do, well, there are opportunities to pilot new systems of assessment. And I didn't talk a lot about the theory of change, but if you think about what is the theory of change for our current assessment system, it's essentially, if we have data at the school, it'll be used for improvement. And if schools are struggling, then we'll get extra resources to those schools. There's some research that shows that the resources aren't getting to the schools. And if the problem is the resources, the schools need more resources, then why don't we look at adjusting the school funding formulas that are fundamentally based on personal or property tax, the local level? There are some root cause issues here. Well, looking at piloting new systems of assessment, how about working with communities to develop a new theory of change informed by diverse stakeholders and new definitions of success? How do we design culturally responsive and sustaining assessments that are meaningful? We know that we have students leaving the system. They are leaving the system. They're not finding it relevant. In K through 12 education, they're not engaged. Are the policies that we have in place bringing students in and giving them powerful, personalized, student-centered learning experiences and powerful assessment tied to how students learn best are about providing these enduring, deep ways of knowing and building knowledge and skills? Are we doing that? Is our system supporting that? How do we develop partnerships with communities where every student can see themselves in the teaching and learning experience and in the assessment experience? And if we're not doing that, we're not actually designing our schools based on how kids learn best. And Fred, did you want to take the last bullet?
Not a problem. And lastly, I think it's we think it's incredibly important to think about how we investigate and creative measures to form new funding formulas for equitable resource allocation. And so this is important. Right now, things like race or poverty or performance and consideration when establishing just new innovative ways for states to fund schools, for states to fund school districts. And so there have been states such as New Mexico, for example, that have taken a family poverty income index and used things like poverty, specifically race, performance, other social and emotional needs into consideration when there was extra funds in the state. And so they were targeting resources in a way that we think is much more equitable. And so states have an opportunity to use creative measures and pilot things like this outside of the traditional funding formula. And so it's important to know, like, there are instances in which, if there is a political will and if there is hopefully funding available, there's different ways to fund schools themselves to help serve some of the neediest kids in places all across the country. So with that, I think next slide. And I think, Susan, you are going to run through these examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's encouraging is that there are states embracing these opportunities. In Kentucky right now, Commissioner Jason Glass is working deeply with local communities having conversations about fundamentally rethinking what next generation accountability can look like. And what does that mean for teaching and learning? With reciprocity with what local communities need and express and want. Well, it's about rethinking purpose, but also rethinking what accountability with reciprocity, with those in the community having a say in what we're looking at and how we're developing that. This is breakthrough work. Kentucky started with innovation zones in 2012, and now they're fundamentally challenging the current accountability paradigm and frame. In Minnesota, There's a House Select Committee that published a report on racial justice with recommendations that are cross-cutting education. In New Mexico, as Fred just mentioned, there is also a project, the Reciprocity Project, which is led by Future Focused Education and work with the Center for Collaborative Education, which is out of Massachusetts, on how can accountability be more reciprocity with community needs, with addressing the forced ranking, sorting, culling to one that meets a higher purpose. They're working on graduation capstones to completely redesign their assessment systems and support anywhere, anytime community-based learning, paid internships. And they're working to redesign their state funding formula with a family income index. In Washington State, they've gone from a competency-based ed task force to a pilot program to a full-on mastery-based learning collaborative, bringing in support for professional learning communities, for competency-based student-centered learning environments. And we're working with them to do research and evaluation on how practice is shifting and how equity is being addressed through these new learning designs. At the federal level, Fred, I know you've been working on this for a while. The funding for the competitive grants for state assessments was just increased to 29 million with a competitive priority for competency-based assessments and multiple measures. So I think we're seeing progress, and there are other states that you want to highlight and mention. I'll turn it back to you and you can share some resources.
Sure. No, I think that's a good summary here. The feds are also trying to work with states and other members of Congress to improve assessment design, which is incredibly important, and provide actually more funding to states so they can pilot new assessments as well, which is just really critical. And then if we go to the next slide, I just want to run through some resources, both from the Aurora Institute and the Southern Education Foundation, where we have our federal policy priorities, innovation zones, designing for equity. Again, if you guys want to get more information about our original piece on that, and also a book that Susan authored or co-authored, A Promise for Equitable Futures, from the Aurora standpoint. And then we have some resources here at the Southern Education Foundation, which includes very specific public, both federal and state policy priorities. We have information on the economic vitality of education in the South, the digital divide, and also teacher stress and burnout. But here are just some of the resources that are highlighted if you want to look into more information. And I think next slide, I think we will gladly field questions, and maybe we can go back to full screen or where the presentation is down to answer any questions people may have at this point. I know it was a lot of talking, but I guess feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll try to answer as many as possible.
And thanks for Kara, the information on New Mexico on the statewide equity councils and the community-led school design grounded in culturally and linguistically relevant education. To that work is all coming together and building. Any questions? Anyone want to lift up other examples in your communities and just say that we're coming at this with a real eye and commitment towards its local wisdom and local communities that are really shaping the future of education, that we're looking around the country and even around the world for how different approaches are taking hold to create space for real focus on equity-driven, student-centered learning. So a question came in. I'd like to hear more about how post-secondary institutions are partnering to move this change forward nationally, something I feel is blocking progress, the college admissions process. That is a huge one. Fred, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to? I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you jump in with that one, and I'll try to take the next question that we have about shaping policy recommendations and changes and approaches.
Great.
Student involvement and engagement.
Great, Stacy's question. So on the college admissions front, and how are higher ed institutions either partnering to move this field forward. So I'm going to give a shout out to our colleagues at the Learning Policy Institute. Linda Darling-Hammond and her team is heading up an initiative called Reimagining College Access. And they are actually partnering with a number of higher ed institutions on reimagining what college admissions can look like to be more focused on holistic evidence, like portfolios of student work. So falling in this, you've seen some pretty dramatic momentum over the last 3 years, partially due to the pandemic, on college admissions processes moving away from the SAT and ACT standardized testing. That's a piece of it. But there is actually a deeper conversation taking hold. Linda Darling-Hammond is also the chair of the state board in California and working with a number of higher ed institutions across California, including some in the UC system, UCLA. University of Michigan is in these conversations, and a number of other schools. So I would say it is the ranking and sorting that comes along with a lot of the policies in K through 12 education are sort of reflected in what happens in the college admissions process. When you boil an entire individual youth's learning from K through 12 down to a single number, a single GPA, and then use that in a ranking and sorting way in college admissions, thinking about the impact that has on the whole system for access and equity. So there is work underway, and more needs to be done. I'm happy to follow up with folks. So Fred, on Stacy's question, how have students been involved in shaping policy recommendations, changes, and approaches?
Sure, it's a great question. I'll just speak about a recent experience here in Georgia. There was recently a classroom censorship bill that was actually passed by the state legislature around what folks have come to, I think, understand what CRT is, but there was a pretty organized effort from students across the entire state. They had over 150 students come and actually testify at the legislature around the importance of learning an accurate form of history that includes talking about race and slavery. And although the bill passed, it was certainly not as strong as what it was. And to me, that's probably, the most recent example that I can cite specifically, but I do think that there are efforts all across this country where young people are rising up to talk about the needs that they have, but also the type of education that they want to receive, which includes more personalized learning, where they can see themselves in the curriculum, where they're empowered, where they have agency. And I think students are just getting much more vocal because they also understand. I think Susan made a wonderful comment when she was referencing the fact is, when she's talking to folks and they're asking, can our education system change in time where it doesn't necessarily, I forgot the quote that you specifically said, but it's essentially, can our education system change fast enough to deal with these pressing issues? Because our globe is changing, climate change and all these things are eradicating potentially the human species. And so young people understand this. They understand that this is the issues that they're going to have to deal with. And I see, just anecdotally, more young people involved in the political system all across the country. And Georgia is just one example of this, but I'm sure there may be others who can speak to this specifically. But that's just one thing that I would cite in terms of they made one policy not as bad as it once was. And that's just something I can reference, but I'm sure that there are others.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? And with that, are there specific adult actions or statewide practices that provide those lanes for students to bring their voices? I mean,
so you're saying like specifically what can like adults do to help?
Yes. So I'm yay for the students, yes, in doing that. And oftentimes then I see like, what is our adult role in stepping back? And
so I would say that when we get invited by legislators or by state board members, we ask to bring students with us, student perspectives. I'm going to give another shout out to New Mexico. Groups of student activists have really been weighing in on what they want to see. They did a whole Student Voices project where there was a youth-led organization that did videos and asking questions around assessments, fundamental pieces of policy. What's working for you in K through 12 education? What's not? What do you want to see more of? So are we asking youth what their needs are directly? Are we bringing students with us into those policy conversations? If there is an event that you're hosting in your community or in your state, do you have students presenting? Are there student voices? We host a symposium conference at the end of October, and last year 40% of our sessions included students in them. So think about the different ways of where you can include the voices of our youth in the work that you're doing, and make sure that their perspective is there. And there's a lot more to do too.
And I just want to provide a 30-second response on top of what Susan just said, just very, very short. And Stacey, I hope this is also tangible. One is like the adults need to play the connective tissue role of support. Sometimes that literally is getting like making sure transportation is set up in a way where you can actually bring the student to the legislator. And so whether that's actually to the state, I was going to say Capitol Hill, but to the state legislature or wherever they are, or site visits, but actually providing the transportation so students can actually meet with these key decision makers. I think the second thing is at every moment, I want to just elevate what Susan just said, provide an opportunity for students to elevate their voice, whether it's now through Zoom or video conferencing, or whether it's at specific events. The student's voice needs to be put out front. And then thirdly, host events. I'm gonna give the Royal Institute a big shout out, because I even think during our student-centered learning conference that we had back in October, the most engaging session was led by students, and their student voice was out front. And that gave us an opportunity to help actually change policy, or at least influence policy, by having opportunities for legislators to hear from them directly, but also using those stories to help inform what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Love it. Thank you so much.
And I think we're at time.
We're at time. I just want to thank everybody for being here with us. And Fred, thank you so much. And Carly and Lars and the team at Education Evolving and the Hope Bush Foundation. Thank you for hosting this important conversation.
Thank you as well. And I'm going to just put my email in here too, just in case anyone wants to reach out to me offline. Susan, you may want to do the same, but I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And hopefully if you guys want to invite us back, I would gladly do so. But if not, you guys can just consider us a resources. And thank you again.